I'm Allie, and today on Plotopsy, we're diving into the dream world with Lieske, discussing her first book in the Unseen Operative series, The Lattice Scheme. Let's go ahead and get started. So I have to know, what inspired the idea of dream interrogation as an investigative tool?
Dreams. So years ago when I was in elementary, I had read this study that talked about how the brain takes all the stimuli happening around us, interactions, memories, subconscious thoughts, etc., and it pulls it all together into dreams. And dreams are really just trying to categorize and make sense of those things. And I thought, that's kind of neat. So it's like a mixture of all the truth that you do or do not recognize in a hodgepodge kaleidoscope. Stuck that in the back of my brain. Didn't think about it much, but it was back there. And so when I started finding myself writing this fiction mystery book and FMC was suddenly in a dream experiment, it just clicked right in the back of my mind that if dreams are this collage of truth, what could we learn about or from others if we could see into their dreams? Moreover, in a crime situation, what could their subconscious reveal that they had seen or known that perhaps they don't recognize in the waking world, or they're trying to suppress? So if you think about that, it could come to things like more accurate eyewitness accounts, admissions of traumas, true feelings about certain individuals, because those emotions in dreams can often be a little more amplified than we'd like. Not all the time, of course. Dreams, they do mix the untrue with the true, especially with our imaginations throwing things in. But if there was someone actively in those dreams, sorting out between those two things, between the real, the unreal, the true and the untrue, what would they find? And that's where the idea came from.
That's a really thought-provoking idea. Beyond the logistics of it, what does dreamwalking represent emotionally for Azure?
That is a fascinating question. You see, humans attach meaning to things as our lives change, whether because of them, despite them, or in spite of them. At the start of the book, The Lattice Scheme, dreamwalking is simply something extraordinary, something marvelous that helps Azure overcome a barrier in her life, which is insomnia. This ability gives her full restorative rest. It lets her concentrate on the work she hopes to be promoted in. It allows her to enjoy life more fully, and that's really all that it was. But then she earns a promotion because of that ability, and some resentment starts coming in. She feels, as she says repeatedly throughout the book series, like a lab rat. And yet the ability is undeniably useful. By the middle of the book, she's almost eager to use it as a tool for gathering information. And then she learns the truth, that she will never be free of it and it will eventually consume her life. So in book 2, dreamwalking then becomes her constant. It's the one reliable, inescapable element of her existence, whether she likes it or not. It's just always there. So what does something like that represent emotionally? I would say ask somebody who began medical marijuana to manage symptoms, regain their life, but then they became dependent on it, facing worse long-term consequences. Or ask somebody who raced dirt bikes or mountain bikes until one day an accident changed their body forever. Ask somebody who's lived healthily but contracted HIV from a single night with the wrong person. Ask somebody who tried to lose weight responsibly and ended up with a heart condition, or someone who binged one time, slipped into an eating disorder, recovered, but still carries permanent cardiac damage. Dreamwalking, just like many of those situations, is a ticking time bomb that Azure picked up without ever intending to, because no one including her understood what it truly was. Chronic or terminal illnesses, chronic or terminal limitations, chosen or not, these are endlessly reinterpreted. Throughout history, people have always been assigning meaning to them, from sins and blessings and curses, destiny, punishment, divine favor, genetic anomaly, all of these things. Everyone has a position in trying to define or put some sort of meaning, explanation, or label on it. And sometimes that is helpful, but oftentimes I would argue that it's not. For Azure, dreamwalking just becomes a fact. It's the pervasive new reality of her existence. She can't get rid of it. It just simply is. Some people in her situation might turn such a condition into a purpose, into a mission, even empowerment. Others might see it as a curse, an inadequacy, or a punishment. It can become a label that consumes identity either way. And no matter the interpretation, the emotions will always evolve and resurface. So if dreamwalking represents anything emotionally, I would say that it represents the human experience of choice, the daily requirement to decide who we are within a finite circumstance. It's that power, or rather that burden, of determining whether something is good or bad, whether it is liberating or damning, meaningful or meaningless. So this is just a wrestle that I and my readers get to explore throughout the entire series.
Those are some really interesting comparisons, and I never thought about the cost like that. Now, beyond the effects of dreamwalking, what's the risk of entering someone else's subconscious?
I would say there are many risks, which Azure, the main character, gets to experience some throughout the series, but I will just share 3 of those. So the first is the risk of information. Knowing things can be a burden. You know, the saying that ignorance is bliss, that is so often true. Sometimes some things that you wish you'd never known, once you know them, they become corrosive and very, very difficult to reconcile. For example, one of my characters, she's forced into a situation where beyond her will, she does something that is utterly terrible and illegal, but she has no memory of it. And yes, the memory can be restored to her, but if it is, it will destroy the peace and delicate balance that she has found for not only herself, but those around her. So many of us in life, we have this picture of everybody around us, these stories of who they are that we tell ourselves. And then when certain information shatters that narrative, we experience betrayal, which can be very traumatic to the point of changing one's entire construction of reality. So, I mean, I actually had that growing up. I grew up with an abusive father, and so what I knew to be normal and safe was not. And the moment I realized that, my reality was destroyed. Now, the truth does need to come out regardless, but we have to acknowledge that there is a great deal of pain and difficulty that comes with truth coming out, at least to somebody, especially when it is a very heavy truth. Not everybody wants to know, for example, that their child got murdered. But somebody in the legal system has to discover that. And then they have to be the one to carry that information with them all their lives. So that is one burden that these detectives that go into the mines and get the information have to bear through their lives. And not just for one thing, but for every little bit of information about people that they come across. It can be a pretty icky thing, right? Can also be very fascinating, I'm sure. It's information, good or bad. It's a burden. Now, for the second thing is you take that one step further. Have that investigator experience the mindset of a killer, of a criminal. You know, shared emotional experiences and realities in their mind. It can become very difficult to see some people in a certain light and not be led to a terrible, inaccurate, or harmful way of thinking when you share their mind. You know, mind games have a personal effect. In real life, we see trauma even without being in someone else's mind come from things like this. Therefore, to share or to be in the mind of another, that is a risk all the worse. And my dreamwalkers get to experience parts of thoughts and emotions from all of the dreamers they go in. I don't really play that up in book 1 as much because that book is an introduction to get the reader's feet kind of wet into the series. But in book 2, the presentation of it is a lot more intense and very abundantly written. I'll just say that. Then number 3 is cognitive damage. So in this series, dreamwalking kind of arises from the fundamental incompatibility of shared mental occupation during dreamwalking. And so this theory comes from 2 governing principles. They're scientific principles. The first is Locard's exchange principle, which is actually a foundational concept of forensic science. And it states that whenever 2 objects come in contact, there is a mutual exchange of material. So apply that neurologically, it suggests that when 2 minds interface through subconscious pathways, there's this unavoidable bidirectional transfer of information, whether it's, you know, data, emotion, or residual cognitive imprinting. So in cases of dreamwalking interference, this becomes more invasive as external manipulation actively disrupts and then rewrites neural pathways rather than merely exchanging fragments of thoughts. So there is damage involved. The second is that of the poly-exclusion principle. So this holds that two particles cannot occupy the same quantum state simultaneously. In other words, where I am, you cannot literally be in that same space of existence. It doesn't work. So in the Dreamwalking framework, it's extended metaphorically to the cognition that two minds cannot fully occupy the same neural space without conflict happening. When overlap is forced, the brain is required to resolve the incompatibility through structural adaptation, which includes rerouting, suppressing, or pruning existing neural pathways. So together, those two principles explain cognitive damage as a consequence, forced neurological reconciliation. Or in other words, if we share minds, I'm going to lose a little bit to gain something of yours and vice versa. So I described a lot of this science in the second book, although both principles are actually mentioned in the Lattice Scheme by Christopherson and Detective Granger, respectively.
That's kind of disturbing, the idea of Lockhardt's exchange principle, like someone entering your brain and inflicting damage. I honestly don't know how you kept track of all these moving parts. How did you structure the layered mysteries so they interconnect later?
I did not plan it in advance, not at the beginning. See, I was never planning on writing a fiction book. I thought I would entertain it for maybe a week and just let it blow over, get back to my nonfiction writing. So I was a pantser at the time. I would just allow the material that was already present in my mind to just come out, and the convictions embedded, just they would surface. And as the draft progressed, my mind began to form connections organically, almost in real time alongside the narrative. So the series, as far as I knew at the time, it began with a single fixed point. There was a detective who was approaching Azure, and beyond that, I had no defined case or outcome whatsoever. I remember mentioning it to my husband that I started this book, and I have no idea what it's about. He said, "That's great." So supportive. But I knew her first assignment would involve some sort of missing Italian agent, but the nature of the larger investigation was just beyond me. You know, in chapter 3, there is actually a dialogue between Azure and Detective Granger in a park where he hints at a matter of significant magnitude, and readers have responded very positively to that chapter and dialogue. But at the time, I had no idea what he was referring to whatsoever. It was only as I continued drafting that the underlying structure of the mystery began to reveal itself to me, with the connections emerging. So once draft 1 was complete, I did do a light structural outline to make sure that these layers were all making sense and interconnecting properly. But as far as at the time that I was writing it, it just happened. That's all I can say, is it just happened. For books 2, 3, and 4 of the series, I have since developed a more deliberate framework, including a physical crime board or minutia of web literally on my walls. And they don't have a definite outline. I never actually identified the criminals of the exact scheme until I write it, but I have that there because it ensures the integrity of the overarching mystery and theme of this series, the things that I am exploring, which I have now got a very solid idea about. But none of that structure existed during the creation of book 1. It just emerged from and beyond it. That being said, I will give myself a little bit of credit. I do consume a significant amount of unsolved crime analysis, and over time, this has kind of developed into a habit of drawing connections across disciplines like history, academic texts, philosophy, all of that stuff that I just like to delve in. And so that cognitive pattern naturally lends itself to the layered mystery construction. I have come to regard the process as kind of analogous to assembling a piece of art. If the narrative elements do not interconnect to me once the book is finished and it doesn't reflect the whole, then the work feels really incomplete.
I find it insane that you did not have this all planned out from the beginning. Your brain must be a magical place. Now, I know you planted a lot of hidden clues in the first book. How did you go about including those Easter eggs that only fully click in later books?
Great question. So for me, Easter eggs do not usually begin as deliberate hidden clues. They tend to emerge through the writing process and only later reveal their significance as the larger structures of the series come into focus, much like my plotting of the layered mystery. So for example, in the Lattice Scheme, there is a sequence of dreams involving Alma Morales that initially reads as somewhat disconnected, aside from establishing that she had a deeper connection to this Mahomes figure, and she has a tendency to be running from something unresolved. I actually considered cutting that chapter or at least reducing its weight, but it felt like it was going to be very significant. I had that gut feeling, and so I kept it, and I'm so glad I did because it has significant relevance that begins resurfacing in book 2 and all converges by book 3. So if anybody's read that chapter, just know it matters. It matters very, very much. A similar process actually occurred with characters like Phineas Granger and Holden Wagner. They were not fully fixed in their final interpretive or internarrative form during book 1. Just as I wrote, I learned more about them through their dialogue behavior and then began layering the subtleties later as the book expanded. So like draft 2, I'd make sure that this part that seems like an Easter egg to me, I'm going to really polish it. And so that's what I did. So just in general with my books, what may appear to be deliberate clues were often just discoveries that I later enforced. And I really do believe that that is a thing that occurs with lots of authors. Some do go out of way to put a specific Easter egg in, but then there's those of us that really we discover them as they go. I would say like even early descriptions of narrow chip capabilities in my book follow this pattern. So any inconsistencies that were initially described, they become very, very meaningful. And that is all I will say for that.
That's really cool that you get to discover these connections alongside the reader. Now, the setting. Why is this in a post-Third World surveillance-driven system?
Buckle up for a long answer. It's a funny thing that I still marvel at. It was not supposed to be, in my mind, at all. The story itself is very classical in the style that it's written, and it's got many old world elements and past elements like landlines, phone booths, cobblestone streets, trains, etc. But the problem with that, doing a story in the past, was that the experiment that occurred and the background information for the origin of Dreamwalkers did not make sense in the past at all. And it also needed to come from a war because there's a very serious message centered across the series that has to do with a war. So I had to put it in the future. See, this is where my nonfiction observations come in, so just bear with me on this. There is a literal war in all ages of time, but especially in the age of technology against our minds and perceptions. Between marketing, political, social agendas, personal opinions, philosophies, and so forth, we're always being told by millions of sources every day what to think, how to think, what is real, what is not real, who we are, how we define reality, and so forth. And it grows constantly. So do the negative mental and emotional health rates. And I think that's also got something to do with the general disability or growing disability to make and keep commitments by legal contract or whatever they may be. Stability is just becoming increasingly difficult to find in this world. And I really do believe that this is a huge part of many ideas being freely and often irresponsibly pushed out in technology. Now, I'm not saying that all things should be controlled. That's not the point. Though that is an aspect of the extremity in the series that is being explored with the idea of World War III. But for the Lattice Scheme, which is book 1 of the series, World War III is the idea of a free-for-all extremity when rights are given with little accountability and it goes too far. You know, societies, they collapse when there's little connected and firmly accepted foundations to hold everybody together. And that is when the future has to kind of revert to the past. Responsibility and control must be taken to prevent the misuse of technology in a manner that harms rather than helps society. So yes, everything is surveyed and the borders are tight, or at least tightly managed for most nations. But for America, it's not in the sense that the government is trying to control everybody. The motive is national survival and safety. So the Constitution is still holding. And yes, crime is addressed very quickly with the surveillance, and it's at an all-time low. Not perfectly, but you know, there's no extreme or unusual punishments. There's not taking away the people's rights to vote and public press and so forth. Capitalism, as it once was in the earlier years of the nations, is back in the narrative, but without the barriers of inequality. So it's not super inhumane by any means. And I set it up that way to kind of let the reader determine a couple of things. First, they get to question, is this a dystopia, a utopia, or is it just the response that humans with their best judgments, being imperfect, have made to counter the extremes that previously caused millions of deaths? I just want to put it out there. To me, government, as I see it, will always be imperfect. And really, how we view it depends largely on our circumstances and our experience with it. And then the second thing I want readers to explore with me is both the virtues and the vices of government without it being in the current charge of politics that we have right now. Post-World War III, that far into the future, allows me to do that exploration without sparking one side directly. So the Lattice Scheme takes place in 2438, which is far enough in the future for me to write this now and be able to change World War III to World War IV if that happens, but it's also close enough that it's relevant to our time.
It's definitely relevant and makes you reflect on the uses and the effects of technology. Now, I know we've talked a little bit about the effects and the risks of dreamwalking, but how did you want readers to feel about the cost of Azure's ability?
I want my readers to discover and sit with whatever feeling the realization of having limited time invokes in them. For some, that is going to be panic or pain. For others, it's going to be more of a recognition of how short and fragile life really is. But if it isn't some form of panicking or piercing, I hope they will consider just how connected they are to the reality of living and where it is that they're getting their peace from, whether it's a true source of peace or some sort of apathy. See, when we come to realize that death is imminent, and perhaps sooner than we had ever considered it to be, it changes how we view things, and it changes how we behave. An initial realization of something like this, it can prick us to consider what we would want to do and who we would want to be if our days were very, very quickly numbered. If we're not careful, however, we can become very apathetic or even extreme in those responses. So really, what I am asking my readers to do is to explore within themselves and to learn something about themselves from how they respond to that.
That's a really scary subject to broach with readers, and I love that you didn't shy away from it. So now we know there's risk involved with entering people's dreams, but what's more dangerous, the dream world or the people controlling access to it?
I would say the people accessing it and those controlling access to it are the most dangerous. The dream world itself is harmless. We enter it, or at least a portion of it, nightly. So it, in and of itself, cannot hurt anybody. But those who come to live there and those who do things in it, that is very, very dangerous. I'd say another query that could be made is whether the dreamwalkers are more dangerous than those controlling the dreamwalking technology. And that sort of question is one that is a common one explored among science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction. I would even say romance sometimes touches on it from time to time. But every genre has its own take as to what the motives, costs, and benefits of each side of the argument has. I like to split that just a little bit differently. There are two groups on each side, two on the side controlling the technology, two on those who are able to enter into dreams. And each of those two within those two categories have differing motives. So a bit of a spoiler here. Anybody turn away if they don't want spoilers. But the antagonist group of the entire series has an agenda to utilize dreamwalkers as well as other subconscious interfering technologies to gain global power and secure stability across the globe for itself and its entities. So following the Third World War, everybody can see that there's, a little too much of a good thing can go a very, very wrong way when it's used irresponsibly and causes damage. Therefore, this group is trying to ensure that that power stays with them, because if it's not with them, somebody else is going to step up and try to take it. That's just how we are as humans. We like to rise up, we like to keep things in our own hands, and we're always competing. So then the other side of that equation, of the dreamwalking technology equation, is that there's a doctor who was briefly associated with one of those groups that brings a part of that technology to America and recreates the same thing there, thus bringing our FMC into the ability to enter into dreams. But the purpose there is different. It's to aid investigation to keep the peace. It's about protecting the people, not about keeping the power. So then we go to the dream side of things. Group 1, the antagonist group, of course, has some dreamwalkers, and that motivation is pretty much the same for all we know. But on the other side of the dreamwalking equation, there is a group called the Oniri. This is a group of escapees from the original antagonist group's experiment, and their whole entire prerogative is trying to prevent the subconscious minds of as many globally as they can from being impacted by the antagonist group. They're seeking to prevent interference, to bring an end to the creation of more dreamwalkers, as well as the subconscious technologies meant to bring others into some form of submission by the antagonist group. They're not working with the US Bureau, but they do happen to collide with it, as well as our FMC. So that is something she gets to weed out. So taking all of that just kind of at face value, it's easy to say that, the US Bureau on the one side and the Oniri on the other, they are less dangerous because they have good motives, right? Freedom and choice. That's what they seem to signify. But I would argue all of that hinges on the American perspective of rights, responsibilities, and what's good for the welfare of all. The antagonist group's collective keeping the peace could make the same arguments because the very same events that led to the Third World War of this series happen to be the same values that America, with its rights and responsibilities, kind of is promoting in a sense. I'll let the reader kind of argue with that and see where they want to go, but that is the pickle, is your social or cultural perspective causing you to see the good in one side versus the other. Now, if we consider the previously discussed matter of the impact dreamwalkers have in the minds of the dreamers, there is always a neurological change. There's always potential for damage. Therefore, both sides are tampering with people's minds in some way, and the damage is unpredictable. So in that sense, both groups are dangerous in some way, shape, or form. And that is my take, I suppose, on the common theme of whether holding a power to technology or being the one using the technology is more dangerous in comparison to each other. See, the twist is that it comes in light to what the readers will realize the costs and motivations are of both sides and which one ultimately holds more virtue.
This has been a really interesting conversation, and the world of the Lattice Scheme is absolutely fascinating to me. Thank you to Lieske for being here today with us. Go check out the Lattice Scheme and the second book, The Fallacy Web, of the Unseen Operative series, which I will have linked in the comments below. And don't forget to join us next week or next Tuesday, depending on my insanity of scheduling, for another Plotopsy.